chapter 16, and although I'm running late, we're going to try to start pretty much where I left off the other day. We did not I was not able to get the little film to process, so let's try it and see if it'll do it today. It worked earlier for me, so I don't know. It's a little bit sophomoric, and in many ways it's a little bit humorous, but it's also a little bit informative, which will be kind of a review of what we didn't get covered. So let's see what happens. If it doesn't work again, no big deal, but I would really like for you to see it. It looks like it might be going to play.
Hi, I'm Dr. Washington and I'll be teaching you about the scientific revolution. Before we begin, I have to explain to you how the universe works. As you can see from the image above, the Earth sits in the center of the universe. It does not move, ever. The other planets all move in a circle around it. The Sun is the fourth planet away from Earth, and it moves in a circle around too. The stars are all in a ball that exists beyond the other planets. That makes perfect sense, right? Right? No? You don't agree? Well, maybe this will help explain it. You see, it is very simple. The Earth is in the middle and all the planets are spinning around it. I know some people will try to say that the Earth is moving too, but that is ridiculous. I mean, come on, I'm standing right here on the Earth and I don't feel it moving. I'm an adult and a teacher, I must be right. You're just kids, what could you possibly know? Okay, now that you know what it was like to live before the scientific revolution, let me admit I made that all up. Of course the Earth moves, and of course the Sun is in the middle. I just wanted you to see what the early scientists had to deal with. A revolution is a dramatic, meaning huge, change. It is like doing the total opposite of what you were doing before. Science changed from what people thought to what they observed. Instead of just saying something because it made sense, they took the time to see it for themselves. They started doing actual experiments to test their ideas. Can you imagine science without experiments?
The Church is already fighting a war of ideas with the ongoing Protestant Reformation. The Congregation of the Inquisition is established in 1542 to suppress heretical ideas and police Catholic theology. Macabre devices such as the rack are used to extract confessions. Torture techniques like strappado, where the hands of the accused are tied behind their back as they're hoisted until their shoulders dislocate, lends additional persuasion to the unlucky accused. There is probably in all of human history nothing quite as terrifying as an interrogation in the Inquisition. You start with the premise that you're guilty, and it's just a question of whether you can come to appreciate your guilt. One of the first thinkers to advocate heliocentrism is an outspoken monk named Giordano Bruno. Not only does Bruno embrace the sun as the center of our solar system, he believes in an infinite number of solar systems. In 1600, the Inquisition deals with him harshly. Giordano Bruno is declared to be a heretic, and he is not willing to compromise in any way with this belief. He asserts it to be truth, and he is tried, convicted, and burned at the stake. After Bruno is executed, many feel it's too dangerous to contradict church doctrine.
These new scientists were challenging hundreds of years of tradition that had come from the church. It was the church, for example, who taught that the earth was in the center and did not move. The church did not appreciate these scientists challenging them. They threatened the scientists with excommunication and even death if they did not follow the teachings of the church. The question really became about truth. The scientists could just stay quiet and ignore what they believed was true, or, like in the movie The Matrix, they could take a red pill and explore new ideas and really a whole new world. Most people kept their mouths shut, but a few brave men pushed science forward. Oh man, I love this song. If these men were going to start a new way of study, they needed some rules, so they created the scientific method. Before this, science was simple. You just took whatever the church said was true and accepted it. The scientific method, though, says first you come up with an idea or hypothesis. Then, you go out into the world and observe how things happen. Then, when possible, you design an experiment and test your idea out.
Galileo's Italy of the 17th century is a far different place than today. The country is divided into autonomous city-states in the north, papal-controlled territory in the center, and monarch-ruled kingdoms in the south. In this overwhelmingly Catholic land, the Pope holds authority over all. But the Church is being tested by a new age of discovery.
The 1600s are a time of tremendous tension and intellectual ferment. You have on the one hand the traditional sense of the order of the universe enforced by the church, and you have all these new discoveries. You have the discovery of the new world. You have new instruments. You have new techniques. You have new industries.
In spite of the innovations of the era, the ancient teachings of Aristotle, dating back to the 4th century BC, are the bedrock of conventional wisdom. Aristotle's view of the heavens puts Earth at the center, with the stars and planets revolving around it. This geocentric worldview seems to be supported by the Bible.
The Bible makes reference to the Earth having been created and set on its foundation, not to be moved forever.
By the time you reach the age of Galileo, Aristotle has been the platform for knowledge for centuries. When somebody has been presented for such a long period as the ultimate authority in absolutely everything, it takes a lot of work to take that apart.
The first person to present a viable alternative to Aristotle's geocentric worldview is a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus. In 1543, he proposes a heliocentric view of the world, with the sun, not the Earth, at the center.
Well, as I said, it was a little bit sophomoric, but it did give you some good information. This is just a presentation. We did go over this a little bit about how they originally believed in the geocentric form, where the Earth stood still and everything revolved around it, and of course God being the prime mover. But these beliefs did not conform to the ideas that they were getting from the observations. After all, Mars seemed to go in a backward motion, and The problem of the calendar days wasn't working out. So enter Nicholas Copernicus. He was known as a true Renaissance man, which meant he was an expert in astronomy and canon law and medicine. And he thought the whole system had just become way too messy. And he comes up with the idea that the Earth moved and was not the center of the planetary system. The Earth rotated on its axis and actually orbited the Sun. He believed that he had restored a true, pure understanding of God's plan, but was troubled by some of the implications, and he wrote a couple of works. Enter Mr. Tycho Brahe. He was born into the Danish nobility, and he was a champion of observation. Everybody needed to look at things. And he observed the appearance of a new star or nova back in 1572, and he built his own observatory. He did not totally believe in Copernicus' ideas, but he said the planets orbited the Sun, the whole of which orbited a stationary Earth. Well, a man called Johann Kepler was his assistant, and he believed that everything had been created according to mathematical laws. And of course, according to him, mathematics was the language of God. And through mathematical perfection and musical harmonies, you could be in tune with the language of God. He came up with 3 laws of planetary motion. Planets traveled in elliptical orbits. The speed of the planets varied with their distance from the Sun, and it would be magnetic forces that kept the planets in the orbital motion. He read several different works, and he broke down the distinctions between the heavens and the earth. So you have new heavens, new earth, and new worldly politics. Enter a man called Galileo. He was a witty and persuasive writer. He wrote in Latin and Italian. He's a popularizer of the non-Aristotelian approach to science and a new relationship between religion and science. I have something. Thought I had. Here's the one I wanted right there. That's going to tell you a little bit about Galileo. Hopefully it's going to play. Yeah, I think it is. This one is kind of funny in several ways. Come on, guy, come on. Here we go.
Hello. Welcome to part 2 of the Scientific Revolution Notes for Mr. Roten. In today's show, we will be talking about Galileo and Isaac Newton for Mr. Roten. Wow, that was weird. Galileo was another great scientist. He continued the ideas of Copernicus. Here's a little bit about his back.
Well, let's try it, but I just done it one time.
Hello. Welcome to part 2 of the Scientific Revolution Notes for Mr. Roten. In today's show, we'll be talking about Galileo and Isaac Newton. Wow, that was weird. Galileo was another great scientist. He continued the ideas of Copernicus. Here's a little bit about his background info.
In 1564, his father was a professional lute player, but due to a lack of demand for top lutenists, was forced to trade in cloth. He ensured, however, that his son benefited from his full attention, and by the age of 10, the young Galileo excelled at the lute. Initially, Galileo wanted to become a monk, but his father father, who couldn't afford for his son not to have an income, persuaded him to become a doctor instead. So, at the age of 17, Galileo began studying at Pisa University, where he became obsessed with the study of Euclid and Archimedes. By now, he had grown into a large, flame-haired rabble-rouser, enjoying fine wine, good living, and poking fun at people. He loved.
Galileo wanted to observe closely how the planets worked. There was no way to do it. He heard about a toy that let you see farther called a spyglass. He got one, and messed around with the lenses, and created a more powerful device known as a telescope. He used it to study the planets closely. He noticed for one thing that Jupiter had its own moon, and that moon moved in a circle around Jupiter. That meant that the Earth wasn't special in its design, other planets could be central bodies as well.
Always fascinated by new devices, Galileo heard that a craftsman from the Netherlands had found a new use for common eyeglass lenses. The first telescope to reach Venice was a toy, a novelty, built to amuse partygoers.
Spectacles, compared to telescopes, are very low tech, but they had been around for several hundred years. It was only when lenses became available in certain range of strengths that one could take the weakest convex lens and combine it with the strongest concave lens and get an appreciable magnifying effect.
Galileo set out to turn the Dutchman's toy into a useful device.
Hearing reports of a new invention from a lens maker in Holland, I determined to fashion a device for myself and was able to make considerable improvements in it.
Galileo realized that spectacle makers could not give him the lenses that he needed in order to make this device more powerful. They just weren't good enough, and they weren't the right strength. And so, in order to improve the instrument, he had to teach himself to grind lenses. And that is extremely difficult. It certainly was in 1610.
At first, Galileo was only interested in the optics of the telescope. With his improved lenses, he increased its power tenfold. But his lenses did more than magnify. By reshaping these pieces of glass, Galileo would eventually reshape our view of the world. With his telescope, Galileo first set out to make some money. The naval arsenal of Venice was the greatest in all of Europe. What if the arsenal had a way to spot enemy ships hours before they appeared in the harbor? Wouldn't this give the Navy a distinct advantage? Installing his new device at the top of St. Mark's Tower, Galileo arranged persuasive, real-life demonstrations.
Numerous gentlemen and senators more than once climbed the stairs of the highest bell towers of Venice to observe vessels so far away at sea that 2 hours and more were required before they could be seen by naked eye without my spyglass.
From within the Venetian Senate came a handsome order for Galileo to supply the arsenal with spyglasses. Galileo was given a generous lifetime salary for his service to the Republic. Part scientist and part self-promoter, for now, his future seemed bright. But soon, his telescope would launch a dispute which would threaten to destroy its creator.
Galileo wrote a book in 1610 to document his findings from his telescope. He wasn't as afraid as Copernicus, because the Church had been weakened, only slightly, during the Reformation. He also believed that the Pope would support his ideas. He was wrong. The Church refused to admit that they were wrong. Galileo even invited them to use his telescope to see the moons of Jupiter for themselves. Many came to look, but all said, "Nope, we don't see it." They argued further and asked him, if the Earth is moving like you say it is, why can't we feel it? Mr. Smarty Pants. Galileo then changed his focus and started to design some experiments to help explain motion.
The story goes that after a particularly impassioned argument with an Aristotelian lecturer, Galileo set out to demonstrate once and for all that objects fall to Earth at the same speed regardless of their weight. He mocked anyone who disagreed with him. In practice, that meant most of his lecturers. He decided to drop 2 different-sized cannonballs from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This would surely settle the matter once and for all. Clutching his irregular balls, he climbed to the top of the tower and tossed them off. They landed on the ground at virtually, but not precisely the same moment, and the crowd was left divided. No one could agree whether Galileo's balls had dropped at the same time.
Tell me when you get a good picture, Joe.
370 years later, David Scott tried the same experiment on the surface of the moon. By repeating the experiment in a vacuum, Scott confirmed what Galileo had argued.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And I'll drop the 2 of them here and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
Falling balls, swinging pendulums, what does it all mean? Galileo was overturning 2,000 years of scientific orthodoxy, and he was doing it not just by observing the natural world, but by carrying out experiments with the help of new scientific instruments which he himself was developing.
Francis Bacon had new confidence in the potential of human thought. He became Lord Chancellor to James I of England, and he decided that there was a difference between the way the ancients believed and the way the moderns believe, because we're believing more by observation. He said we need to separate scientific investigation from this philosophical argument. In other words, don't just take what the church says is true, experiment, look, observe, and came up with something called the inductive method. Now, this inductive method, and I think I do ask you all what that is. It combined evidence from observation to draw general conclusions and encourage cooperation between different researchers. He also wrote this book. René Descartes was an intellectually restless man, and he wrote a discourse on the method. He began as an essay on optics and geometry and meteorology, and yet everyone should doubt everything till arriving at a place that one could not doubt. In other words, if you can't prove it, it's not going to be true. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And I think this is a very cute statement. Descartes knew he could think, and he could consider his doubts, and that proved to be a fact beyond doubt. So the thinking person exists, reason exists, therefore God exists. The deductive method is a fresh start for knowledge. He proceeds logically from one certainty to another, and mathematically saw an expression as the highest standard of reason. The mechanical philosophy was nature is a machine, and he rejected this medieval distinction between the works of man and those of nature. We must move toward a new conception of matter, a new look at nature and natural laws, instead of philosophy. Within a century of Bacon and Descartes' intellectuals, they were followed loosely by 2 camps of followers, those that followed Descartes and those that followed Bacon. The Cartesians were the ones, of course, who followed Descartes, mostly in France and Holland, and instead of experimentation in various fields, they turned instead to mathematics and logic. After all, mathematics is supposed to be the language of God, right? Blaise Pascal, he wrote about the probability theory, inventing a calculating machine and studying theology. Christine Huygens, the important problem of impact and orbital motion. Baruch Spinoza applied geometry to ethics. We're getting more and more into the mathematical part of it. The people who followed Bacon began with the practical research, and the results that could be debated. And he wanted empirical laws passed on evidence. based on evidence, not passed on evidence. William Harvey, a man at the same time between 1578 and 1657, he just studied the circulation of the blood in the human body. He also dissected live animals to find out about the different methods of blood transfusions and ligaments and tendons and things. A man named Robert Boyle, I think they just talk about Boyle's law. It's basically a law that describes how the pressure of gas tends to increase as the volume of the container decreases. A man called Robert Hooke introduced the microscope. So where we've been looking at things bigger and bigger, now we're going to look at things smaller and smaller. And he studied the secular structure of plants. And all these people, they believed in God. They saw God as a clockmaker. And they saw discoveries via the microscope demonstrating the complexity of design by God. So these people were not non-believers in God. They believed that God gave you a mind, and mathematics was the language of God. The Royal Society was chartered in 1662 in England, and it was committed to experiment and collaborative work. It served both political and intellectual purposes. But it basically had a common sense of purpose. I mean, we're going to have scientists are going to cooperate and share their ideas. And something called the Philosophical Transactions was published in 1665, and it reached out to the professional scholars all across Europe. Meanwhile, just a few years later, the French Academy of Sciences in France published a journal 2 months before the English did. Now, this was a state-sponsored framework for scientific endeavors and eased the exchange of information and theories between scientists. Of course, it's always a debate who's the best and who was the first, but we know that. England was the first, but France published a work first. The academies of both France and England and other countries that they were also set up were most 100% pure male. Francois Poullain de la Barre said that the mind has no sex. Very true. But there were women professors in European universities, except for Italy. Elsewhere, women had to educate themselves, and they critiqued those who excluded the female scientists from scientific debate. And it gives you two examples of women who were noted. Marie Winkelmann continued her husband's work in their observatory after he passed and did a lot of good results, but she was refused admission to the Berlin Academy of Science because she was a female. Maria Silva Moran was an informal apprentice to her father. In other words, she worked with her dad, and he was one of those forward-thinking men who believed women should be educated, and studied etymology. And she traveled to Holland colony of Suriname, where she studied insects. But there again, she was refused admittance to the academy because she was a woman. Mr. Isaac Newton, well, he kind of reflects the acclamation of the scientific revolution. He was quite the dude. I don't think I would have liked him very much. He was born to a family of small landowners, which put him in a kind of a upper middle class. And he went to Trinity College to study, and he actually stayed there for more than 35 years, studying and observing and teaching. A reclusive, secretive, and obsessive man. That's putting it mildly. He didn't like people. He didn't like to be around people. He didn't like people reading his works. And how can you be a scientist and, propose things and spread your word of what you're believing and observing if you don't talk to people? But he was a scientist first and most of all, and he studied optics. He used prisms to demonstrate that light was composed of different colored rays. It wasn't just pure white. He used mathematics, and he combined different types of calculus. He studied gravity, and of course we all know the story of the falling apple. Well, he creates the first reflective telescope, and he was elected to the Royal Society in England in 1872. Some of his works for the Philosophical Transactions claimed science had to be mathematical. And of course this was criticized by the scientist Robert Hooke for being too dogmatic and it was too dry and dull. But it was generally well received by astronomers and scientists all across Europe. But Mr. Hooke's criticism led Newton to become even more reclusive and unwilling to share any of his discoveries, including the principle of mathematics, which was a long and difficult work. Purposely to avoid critique from those, Edmund Halley adopted Newton to publish. Edmund Halley prompted Newton to publish what became the Principia Mathematica and was published in 1687. It built on the works of Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Descartes, and Hooke, Newton didn't claim ownership of pride of any of it. He said he was standing on the shoulders of giants. In other words, he learned what he learned from people who knew more and who were great. He didn't try to take all the credit himself. And gravitation was a universal force that could be expressed mathematically, he claimed. He came up with a simple descriptive account of mass and motion, a simple explanation of the laws of gravity. And of course, he was critiqued by the Cartesians. General Schumann in 1713 answered objections to the Principia because they had his theory failed to. He said his theory failed to explain what caused gravity, and it smacked of mysticism. In other words, if you can't show it, you can't see it and feel it, it must be magic or something that you don't know anything about. But Newton had a legacy. Certainty and objectivity lay in the precise mathematical characterization of a phenomena. He was popularized by John Locke in France. When he died, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, which was a great honor. And the French philosopher Voltaire spread Newton's ideas all throughout France. The French female mathematician Émile du Châtelet translated the entire works. Scientists stood for what it meant to be modern. Science was a justification for Western expansion of the empire. And because of science, you had observations. You could look and decide for yourself instead of believing what's been handed down by the church. So you have new answers to fundamental questions. You've got new approaches for amassing and integrating data and information. And science and scientific institutions spread throughout Europe and all the New World. Mathematics assumed a more central role, and it shifted the focus of questions from why to how. So that basically concludes the lecture for the slide set, but I wanted to just remind you that a scientist, basically, in today's terminology, is an expert, and for some unknown reason, we've all come to trust experts. The scientist, the technician, the experts. They must know the answers to our questions, right? We're surrounded by science, whether we recognize it or not. It's just about anything you can touch, smell, or hear. It is a product of science. Furthermore, scientist has a language all its own, a language which uses expressions like rational method, methodology, systematic rules, laws, and behavior, experts, technology, and on and on and on. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, which we just briefly covered, scientists and theologians and philosophers and mathematicians were engaged in a rather heated, vigorous debate over the natural world. Not so much man, but nature. After all, the Renaissance had redefined the dignity of man as perhaps distinct from the human depravity that the Church, the Catholic Church, had preached for all of us. Nature became the new focus. So what does scientists mean to the scientific revolution? One of the problems inherent in this question is that the revolutions barely used the word scientist. Instead, they talked and wrote about natural philosophy and the philosophy of nature. Nature to them meant the natural world, and that what was natural, what was not made by human hands. Now, what I'm going to do, since I've noticed that some of you already taken the quiz, I'm going to go through and change the quiz where you can go into it twice instead of just once. So for those of you who've taken the quiz, and I was surprised at how many had, if you didn't get a full 10 points, go back in and do it again after listening to the lecture and going over the PowerPoint. Check your lessons, your word list rather, and I think there's 7 or 9 men mentioned that you do need to know basically the man's name and what he's known for, like Newton, falling apple, gravity type thing. Something very simple. The rest of it's very self-explanatory. So as I said, I'm going to change it so you can get back in and take the quiz again. And I'll make the due date. Oh, let's see, this is second, third. Let's make it due Tuesday. What's that, the 3rd, I think? It's not, it should be. But I wouldn't worry about the ending date. And I'm also going to, while I'm sitting here at my desk, I'm going to go ahead and record chapter 17 so I can get that one up. My apologies for being so late. I ran into some difficulties with my computer and something called procrastination. I'm afraid that you students are not the only one that have the monopoly on that, even we teachers sometimes. So with that, good luck on 16.